Hi all, welcome back. Okay, we last time out we talked about taste and smell. So we talked about your olfactory system, okay, and your uh, taste buds, and how these two systems are linked, and that without smell you would have about 75% less taste. And we talked about situations where the two are linked directly when it comes to getting the flu or a cold, or if you get damage to a certain region like a broken nose, other things that can happen. Okay, so now we're going to switch to a different sensory system, and which is also coupled with another system. Okay, and normally we just combine these two because they occur in the same region, and that is hearing, or the sense of hearing. So your ear, and the role at which hearing and equilibrium play. Okay, so let's kind of dive into that. So first off, there are three main sections of the ear. Okay, you have the outer external part of the ear, the mid ear, and the inner internal part of the ear. The outer part of the ear you're probably most familiar with. Okay, the pinnae is the fleshy part of the ear. Okay, and it also includes kind of the ear canal all the way up to the eardrum. The eardrum region, the middle of the ear, also includes three very small bones. Okay, and the eardrum, that's kind of the middle. The inner part is these semicircular canals, the cochlea, and different nerves that are associated with that region, along with the Escherichian tube. And we're going to cover all these as we go. Okay, so the parts of the outer ear, okay, the article or the pinnae, that's that funnel shape, collects the sounds, etc. And then you have an external acoustic meatus, okay. This is going to be the tube that's running into the ear. It is lined with cremulous glands, cremunous glands are what produce earwax, or cremunin, and this is also what carries the sound. This tube carries the sound to the tympanic membrane, to the eardrum, and it ends at the eardrum. Okay, and then the eardrum itself. Okay, the reason often that tympanic membrane uh, gets labeled as part of the outer ear is because it is possible to associate it from the outside, associate it with it from the outside. So again, many of these uh, features you probably know, like the helix, okay, the anti-helix or the stem, uh, the lobe of the ear, other things. So that's just the fleshy, the pinnae part of the ear. It has many different labels, many different regions, etc. Some individuals have very good knowledge of what every one of these pieces of the ear are called, especially if you have piercings. You know where the targus is, because that's what they call it when they stick a piercing through your targus portion. Okay, let's look at the middle ear a little bit. Okay, so you have that outer ear. Okay, the acoustic meatus. Okay, that tube that runs in, tympanic membrane. Okay, and so then behind that tympanic membrane, you have air-filled space. Okay, so an air-filled opening. Okay, there are three little bones. Okay, the malleus, incus, and stapes. Okay, and they occur associated with the tympanic membrane, but also associated with the cochlea. Okay, and so normally we say the malleus is the hammer, the incus is the anvil, and the stapes is the stirrup. Okay, but you know, malleus, incus, stapes, three little teeny bones that are attached and will carry vibration from the tympanic membrane to the cochlea. Okay. We'll come back and we'll talk more about how this works. But again, the stapes is kind of that direct contact with the semicircular canals, with the fluid that occurs inside those canals and is associated with the vibrations that are moving from the tympanic membrane through the malleus incus into the stapes, okay, and then vibrates that solution that occurs in the cochlea and semicircular canals. And we'll come back and talk a lot more about that. One of the key components, though, that I want you guys, especially because often we talk about clinical complications or things that happen to individuals with damage to their ears or ear infections and things like that. Most of the time it's not happening on the outside here. It's not part of the outer ear. Okay, so even though a lot of the pain resonates in the outer ear or in the external acoustic meatus, you might feel pain in here. When you have an ear infection, the infection actually occurs behind the tympanic membrane, okay, because you have a nasopharynx passage here, and that's where bacteria can get built up behind the tympanic membrane and cause irritation, etc. But the nerve impulse, the feeling of pain is of the internal ear here. And we'll talk more about those as we go. So just so you can see the malleus, the incus, the stapes. Stapes happens to be the smallest bone in your body. Okay, really small. That's a picture of the three bones on the penny, but nonetheless very small bones. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that tympanic reflex. Okay, so now vibrations, air vibrations are going to move, from the outside inside across the tympanic membrane. Okay, that tympanic membrane is going to flex and move that malleus, incus, stapes kind of situation. Okay, but there's situations that you need a reflex to stop extremely loud sounds from vibrating the bones or causing damage to the bones of the ear. Okay, so individuals that like to go to concerts or sporting events, okay, your tympanic reflex is occurring all the time at these. Okay, and that is, you have muscles that are preventing the bones from being stimulated, overstimulated. So one, you have a tensor tympanium. Okay, that pulls the malleus away from the tympanic membrane. Okay, so remember the membrane is sitting here, the malleus is right up against to it, and every vibration basically smacks that malleus bone. Okay, and that malleus will then hit the incus, push on the incus, the stapes then vibrates, sends a signal to the cochlea. Okay, so one way to prevent that is just move the malleus away from the tympanic membrane, so the tympanic membrane has to flex more, has to move more in order to generate vibrations. Okay? The other way is stapedius. Okay, that pulls the stapes away from the oval window or the oval window, which is where it would generate that vibration into the solution in the inner ear or in the cochlea. Okay, so let's look at kind of different examples of this. So you have this malleus, okay, it's attached via muscles, okay, so you have that tensor tympanium, okay, which can pull the malleus, okay, away from the tympanic membrane. So here you can see that muscle, it's attached to the malleus, okay, and it's pulling that malleus away from the tympanic membrane. The opposite side, in the opposite direction, you have a little teeny muscle, the stapedius, okay, it's attached, that's the stapedius tendon, it's attached to that stapes, and it's pulling the stapes away from that oval window, so it can't generate those vibrations, or not as much vibrations. And this really just prevents extreme damage done to the bones in the region and the inner ear. Okay, let's look at the auditory tube, or the ischion. Okay, I kind of briefly touched upon this. Okay, this is the tube that connects the middle ear to the throat. And you might think, well, why do we want our ears connected to our throat? Well, it was really, really important when you have a membrane in there that's flexible, okay, that membrane, that the pressure around that membrane is controlled. Okay, so if it's just a closed system and you push on that membrane, it could create a lot of pressure behind it and cause massive damage. So instead, when you have air flowing in, vibrations flowing in, some of that release, some of that energy release is through the middle ear and the throat, so that you can regulate pressure within your ear. So really important for maintaining air pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. Okay, most of the time it's closed and it's a valve like in the throat, but you guys know what it's like because most of you have probably flown or been to different elevations or had popping in your ears. When you change elevations, you change air pressure on the outside and the inside changes. Okay, so you can hear these popping and you can feel different things in that region of your ear. Okay, and that's really because the air pressure is building up, and you need to be able to control that. So we often think, oh man, I need to pop my ears, and so we wiggle our jaws and things like that. Well, there's no connection between your ear and the tympanic membrane. You're not doing anything with your ear. What you're doing is you're opening your jaw, and that's trying to get that valve to the throat to open to correct for that air pressure. Okay, so it has nothing to do with your ears. So get your finger out of your ear when you have air pressure buildup. Okay, it has nothing to do with it. Chew some gum, yawn, these kind of things. Okay, so that valve in the throat starts to open up and you get more air in there and you can regulate the pressure better. Okay, so again, changes in altitude, I kind of just talked about that. So rapid descent, etc. So impairs so temporarily impair is an impiration to the ear, and really you're just trying to get the pressure in both regions to regulate and be similar. Okay, so you can kind of get that bulging of the tympanic membrane if it's not. Yeah, just in general, like I said, that popping sound is trying to restore the pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane back to its original state. And so it can take time, but normally it's associated with, inside the throat region and that connection between the ears and the throat. All right, let's talk real quick about a middle ear infection, the otis mediae. So that ear infection, hey, again, most people don't understand this, but it's not on the outer ear. It's on the other side of the tympanic membrane that you have the problem. So the issue that people have is when their ears hurt, and they might have an ear infection, they always want to clean their ear. They always want to get a cotton swab in there and take the gunk out of the ear. It's really not doing anything. The ear infection's on the other side of the tympanic membrane. Okay, and that's because bacteria can travel from the throat into the nasal passage to the middle ear, or from the nasal passage to the throat into the middle ear, and so they can go. There's that little flap that's regulating the pressure. Okay, unfortunately, it does great thing for regulating pressure, but it also opens up and it allows things like bacteria to sneak in, and then when that bacteria gets in there, it can cause a ear infection. Okay. It occurs a lot more in young children because that tube is shorter. Okay, so the auditory tube, the connection between the ear and the throat, it's much shorter. So the bacteria has less distance to travel, so it can sneak in easier. Okay, and so that's why often you have young children develop ear infections more often than adults. Okay, it's treated with antibiotics because these are bacterial infections that occur in the ear, and so if you can destroy that bacteria that's in the ear, then you'll feel better. Okay? Now, if this continuously occurs, then a connection between the outer ear and the middle ear has to be made. Right? Well, it doesn't have to, but it is made. Okay, and that's when a trypanostomy tube is put in, or normally what we just call as lay people, tubes are put in someone's ear. And really what that is a slice or a cut or a puncture to the tympanic membrane and a little tube inserted in there so it can drain that material. Okay, so let's look at that. So again, this is the outer part of the ear. Okay, you have this tympanic membrane. You have this connection. Okay, so that throat, that auditory tube. Okay, the connection between the ear and the throat is here. Bacteria sneaks up in here. Okay, they get deposited right here and they just start breeding and creating all kinds of goodness for themselves. It's moist, it's nice. It can start deteriorating the skin a little bit and cause damage. So what we can do is we can go in here with a very small scalpel called a microtome, or a puncturing unit, and there's lots of ways in which this is done, and you just make a little nick in the tympanic membrane and put that tube there. You insert that tube in there. Okay. Then what happens is it can drain all the fluid that's occurring in the middle ear. It can drain it into the external ear part. So then you could actually clean it out with a cotton swab or something else, or just allow it to drain out by laying your head on a pillow or whatnot, and it will just naturally, gravity will let that material drain out. Okay? All right, now the inner ear. Inner ear is much more complex than the outer or the middle ear. Okay, and this is where all kind of the nerves and the actual signals are being sent. Okay. So first of all, you have the osseous or the bone labyrinth. Okay, so you have these bony canals, okay, that are filled full of perilymph. Okay, now that is like a viscous, semi-viscous liquid. Okay, so then you have the membranous labyrinth. Okay, and so this is more based on tubes of tissue. Okay, and again, they're also filled with a liquid called the endolymph. Okay. And then you have three main regions or portions of the labyrinth. You have the cochlea, which is for hearing. The semicircles, which are for equilibrium. The dynamic equilibrium. We'll talk about both these here in a second. Okay, and the vestibule, okay, which is static equilibrium. So the cochlea is for hearing. So for now, we're going to pay attention to the cochleal region, okay, because that is, associated with the auditory system. Okay, so that internal ear, you have these different labyrinth, these different tubes. These tubes are filled full of fluid, okay, and you have different fluids and different things associated with them. You have ampulla, which we'll come back and talk about, which is associated with balance and equilibrium. Okay, you have these cochlea, okay, so that spiral kind of region is called the cochlea. That's the region at which you're going to have nerve fibers associated with a plate that when that plate vibrates and moves, it pushes down on the nerve fibers that have cilia-like projections, and that will cause a signal to be sent into the cochlear nerve and then into away from the region and eventually into the central nervous system. Okay, and we'll dive more into these in just a second. Okay, so cochlea. So it's that spiral or snail-shaped tube. Okay, it starts off really wide. It's full of fluid. The vibrations move through the fluid. Okay, and then it becomes more narrow as you get closer to the tip. Okay, again, it's an association of both bone, so an outer kind of bone region, and then an inner soft tissue region. There are three main compartments of the cochlea. You have the scala vestibula. Okay, this is the upper compartment. This is the large region. Okay, the big base. And the bony labyrinth, it's part of that bony labyrinth. Okay, this is also where the initial stapes kind of impulse is going to be sent. That's what we call the oval window, is where that signal is sent. Okay, and then you have the scala tympani. This is the lower compartment of the bony labyrinth. Okay, again, also associated with the round window. So you have the oval window and the round window, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then you have the cochlear duct. Okay, and this is kind of the middle compartment of the cochlear region. Okay, and this is the organ of the corti, or the spiral organ is in there. And that's where all the receptors for hearing are held. Okay, so you have regions that are associated with the upper part of the bony labyrinth, the lower part of the bony labyrinth, okay, which allow for signals to be sent, and then you have receptors that are associated with nerves in the cochlear duct. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so you have that lower part, the scala tympanium. Okay, so in this region, you have that scala vestibula. Okay, at the higher end, associated with the stapes, the oval window. So the stapes is creating this vibration. Okay, that vibration is going to enter, okay, into that pirilymph. Okay, that pirilymph will then, that fluid, okay, will allow for the vibrations to be sent along the cochlea, okay, and then the signal to be sent to nerves, okay, and so we'll get into what this looks like right in here. We'll blow this up. So the cochlear duct is filled with endolymph. So you have these vibrations moving through the pirilymph, which is going to cause the endolymph to move, and you have a plate that's associated with cells that can stimulate nerves here. And so we'll blow that up and look at that in a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about individuals who may need or may not have the ability to hear. Okay, and so if there's an issue with the cochlea, with the generation of vibrations to the hearing nerve. Okay, then you can do what is called the cochlear implant. Okay, and so the cochlear implant works in this way. So you have a receiver and recorder, which you can see here, that normally hangs off the ear. And then a little teeny port is made for the transmitter. Okay, the transmitter is going to be connected to a receiver that's inside. And then you have a small electrode cable that runs down, okay, into the cochlea. Okay, and that electrode will then generate the electrical impulses needed for the nerve to be stimulated. Okay, and then you can generate that impulse, and then it goes to the brain, and the brain can tell you what that sound wave was and interprets it. Okay, so kind of a neat system, because now we have this kind of electrical cable that runs down into the cochlea, and that microphone and processor will send different electrical impulses, okay, to the transmitter, and then that's sent down, and it entices the hearing nerves to send signals. Okay, of course, the younger this can be done, the better it works, because individuals will get their brain will get used to the different type of signal that's being sent. Okay, so the signal will be different. The transmitter signal will be different than what a natural vibrations coming off the tympanum would be. But nonetheless, if you can bypass this region, okay, and go right into this region, it can work, and it does work. So now let's go back to the spiral organ. Okay, this is the organ in which actual hearing is coming from. Okay, so the organ of Corti. Okay, so it sits on that upper surface of the basal membrane. It contains hair cells. Should be pretty familiar so far. Majority of all the specialized sensory cells that we've talked about, whether it be olfactory, whether it be taste bud, whether it be auditory, they all have these hair cells, these hair-like projections, okay, which are involved in transmitting or collecting a stimuli. Okay, those hair cells, okay, they contain what we call stereocilia or stereovilli. Okay, so either one. Okay, and that really allows for them to move, shake, vibrate, okay, with the tectorial membrane. So the tectorial membrane passes right over the stereovilli, okay, and when vibrations occur, it causes the stereocilia or stereovilli to contact that membrane, and so you have one membrane, the tympanic membrane, sending a signal, moving bones. Then you have those bones vibrating solution, liquid, okay, moving through liquid, which moves a tectorial membrane, which bends hairs, which sends a signal to nerves, okay. So that different frequency, the different amount of vibration, okay, is what causes different nerve impulses to be generated. Okay, and then it goes to the cochlear nerve, and then that can be sent to the brain, to the central nervous center to process what it is. Okay? Now, the cool thing, just like in taste buds, just like in olfactory, is that different regions, different parts have different abilities to pick up different types of signals. So when we were talking about olfactory and taste buds, we're talking about different chemicals. Here, we're not talking about chemicals. Instead, we're talking about different frequencies of vibration. And so different regions, different receptor cells can pick up different frequencies of vibrations. Okay, and that's based on how many cycles per second, or CPSs, okay, and that will send a different signal. And so this is how you get different tones and amplitudes, and different wavelengths would give you different ability. Okay, so here you can kind of see, this is just a picture of the hair cells. And if you look at this cross section, you can see the scala tympinum is out here, but then you can see this basal membrane right here that is going to be vibrated, and the tactile membrane up here that's going to be vibrated, and then these hair cells, okay, which are going to be bent and change their structure. And that will determine kind of what impulse is sent through the nerve. Okay, and so here's another way to kind of look at it. Okay, so you have tympanic membrane. Okay, vibration is sent from outside inside. It moves the tympanic membrane. Okay, that moves the malleus, the incus, the stapes. Stapes vibrates, sends vibrations through the perilymph. Okay, the perilymph vibrations are then transferred into the endolymph, and then you have these tactile membranes pushing down on the receptor hairs, okay, in different vibrations, okay, and that is triggered back to the cochleal nerve, and then that impulse is sent on. So different vibrations, okay, however many vibrations per second, okay, will be picked up in different regions. So lower vibrations carry further, and so you're picking them up way out here. Okay, higher vibrations would be here, or faster vibrations here. After that cochleal nerve impulse is sent, okay, then it's going to the medulla oblongata, okay, and then the medulla oblongata would send a signal to the pons. The pons then signal travels to the midbrain, excuse me, to the thalamus, thalamus into the temporal lobe, okay, and then that is going to be interpreted. That interpretation would be sent back the same way it came, and if it needs to go back, okay. Otherwise, maybe it won't go back, and it's just an interpretation of, oh, that's these sounds, and because we know these sounds as these words now, we now know what someone's saying to us, and that's kind of how that works. All right, hearing loss. One last thing. Okay, so about 8% of people have some degree of hearing loss. There are two main types of hearing loss. Okay, you have conductive deafness. Okay, this is deafness that is due to conduction of sound vibrations. So it's an interference with that. Normally, it can be corrected, especially if it's just things like accumulation of earwax, okay, in young children, sometimes that's the case. Or you could have an injury to the tympanic membrane, injury to the ossicles, or osteosclerosis. Okay, you could have some bones damage. So sometimes it's corrective, but other times it's non-corrective, especially if this is associated maybe with osteoporosis. Okay, so remember osteoporosis when we were talking about before, or bone that is being deteriorated faster than it's laying down. Remember, you have 3 little bones, and they can't be deteriorated very much. So that stapes starts being deteriorated, it's not going to send that signal, and that'll be permanent deafness, permanent ear damage. Okay, but often, this is very common, conductive deafness. Okay, and you can use different tests. Okay, the Rhine or the Weber test. A lot of times these are done in schools, etc. Okay, and then you have sensory neural deafness. Okay, this is when the nerve pathways are damaged. So this is when the hard parts are kind of damaged. Okay, the membranes, the bones, etc. When the nerves are damaged, is different. Okay, and so you can have this happen. It can be genetic. So the cochlea could be dysfunctional. It could also be part of exposure to certain things like very loud sounds for a very long period of time, factory loud music, explosions, these kind of things. They can damage the cochlea. They can damage those hair cells. Too much pressure can be put on them, okay, which can cause issues. You can also have problems with the central nervous system where you have a tumor that pops up along this pathway, or brain damage, or certain drugs might deteriorate the pathway, and you might lose hearing or create deafness in that way. Okay, so conductive is kind of hard parts or membranes and things like that. Sensory neural is going to be the nerves associated with the auditory pathway. All right, next time we're going to talk other special sensories.